So Spotify is a really, really bad deal for us artists. And I'm going to give you an example why in our contexts. Our band is called Orchestra Gold, and we play psychedelic music from Mali, 60s era, Mali, West Africa. So the reason this comes up is because for us, when COVID hit, we lost all of our gigs. We had to take a really hard, clear look at the things that made sense for us to do from a revenue perspective and the things that didn't. So once COVID hit, we took this opportunity to like sit back and be like, okay, what are the real things that are going to move the needle here and not just get our name out there, but make us some money at the same time. I don't believe that there's a necessary compromise that we have to make in terms of short-term profitability and long-term profitability. I believe it's possible for us to do both. And I think you should too. Let's say I have $100 to spend on advertising. So using the numbers that I've seen on my Facebook ads, if I were to use that $100 on advertisements to send people to Spotify, what Spotify pays us for streams would give us about $25. So of that $100 that we spent, we'd be making about $25 back in streaming, and we'd be wasting the other $75. Now, there's some artists that look at that equation and say, hey, it's okay because record labels and whoever else looks at Spotify, and it's okay to take a loss right now in order to build equity for the future. I totally don't agree with that. I feel that there is no necessary reason why we as artists cannot make money at the same time building the equity that we need to make it to the next level. So I'm going to give you now a few reasons why Spotify is a bum deal for us. Reason number 1, I have no follow-up path with the people that listen to us on Spotify. So let's take YouTube for an example. To contrast that, I can set up remarketing audiences in Google such that the people that interact with my stuff, I can retarget them again. Maybe I can send them ads, or if I'm collecting email addresses, I can set up an ad to do that. With Spotify, there is none of that whatsoever. It's just a complete black box. How are you going to make money if you can't actually follow up with the people that want to listen to what you're making? Reason number 2. According to Jimmy Levine of Apple Music, the streaming services, the streaming platforms, primarily Apple Music and Spotify, although there are many others, are actually not very profitable. People ask the question, why can't these companies spend more money and give more money back to the artists? The reason they can't do that is because they're not making that much money. Why would I want to give my services free to a company that's not making money? Does it beg the question, at some point, is this company going to go out of business or change their business model drastically? These are really big questions that I feel like we should be asking ourselves as artists when we're critically thinking about what to do with our blood, sweat, and soul, and everything else that goes into our music. Reason number 3 why Spotify is a bum deal for us. It distracts us from actually pursuing revenue sources that are sustainable. Say that I spend all this time and money trying to build up these Spotify campaigns that aren't making a lot of money and also don't have a real path to profitability in the future. That takes me away from other activities that I could do as an artist that actually are profitable. Since the virus inquisition hit, we took it upon ourselves to do a full-scale audit of all of the things that we were doing as a band. And at that time, I realized that getting into online courses is actually a much smarter business decision for us as a band than it is to be putting all this music on Spotify. So I took all of our music off of Spotify, and we've been focusing on building online courses. I did the math, and we've only been doing these online courses for like 3, maybe 4 months right now, but we would need about 500,000 streams on Spotify to equal the revenue that we're already making on these courses. So with that in mind, I'm going to leave you guys here today. I hope you enjoyed what I have to say. Do us a favor and click on subscribe if you're still around and you enjoyed what you hear. And like this video too, because what the heck, you know? Just like it. Just like it. Come on. Come on. Okay. I'll see you guys later. Take care.